Another feature of the MAGA decade is an alarming rise in political violence, as we were just saying. Trump himself was shot at during a campaign appearance. Barbara Walter, a professor of international affairs at UC San Diego, is a leading expert on violent extremism and domestic terror. And she speaks with Hari Srinivasan about the recent political assassinations in Minnesota and the presence of US troops in American cities.
Christiane, thanks. Barbara Walter, thanks so much for joining us again on the program. You know, recently we've had this at least visible uptick in political violence, political terrorism, however you want to phrase it. I mean, we had a guy who attacked Governor Shapiro's home in Pennsylvania. We had the killing of the two Israeli embassy workers in Washington, D.C. You know, going back, of course, further, we had the assassination attempt on President Trump. I wonder, as someone who studies these, what does all this political violence say to you at the moment?
Oh, it says that America is on terrible footing right now, and it's not likely to get better in the near future. Domestic terrorism has been increasing since around 2012. Nobody really paid attention to it. Nobody really talked about it until January 6th, and then suddenly it burst into the scene. And law enforcement has been very, very slow to respond. Really until recently, the U.S. government was focused on international terrorism, especially Islamic terrorism. That was the bogeyman. That was the enemy. Nobody wanted to talk about the rise of white nationalist violence. Nobody wanted to talk about attacks on synagogues and African Americans and Latinos. Nobody wanted to actually name what it was, which is Americans turning on other Americans with violence, and so it was allowed to increase, and we're now seeing more and more of it. And it's impossible to ignore, and nothing has changed to reduce it at this point in time.
You know, as we're having this conversation, there's still more information coming out about the gunman in Minnesota who disguised himself as a police officer, and he shot and killed Minnesota State Representative Melissa Hortman, her husband, and also wounded another state senator and his wife in back-to-back shootings. And I wonder why you think these particular lawmakers were targeted, because he had a long list of lots of other people he was trying to go after.
You know, it's really interesting why Minnesota was the target. And when you look at the data, violence tends to happen in places where power is being contested. So not in the deep red states, not in the deep blue states. It happens in the purple states. And if you look historically about where we've had high incidences of, for example, racial violence or politically motivated violence, it's in the cities and the states, and then globally in the countries where power is sort of on the cusp between two different potentially dominant groups. And it especially happens when the once dominant group is demographically in decline. And so if you think about Minnesota, it has a Democratic governor, but its state house and its state senate are basically tied. It also was the scene of the George Floyd murder, and the protests started there. There's been a series of policies, progressive policies that have been passed in terms of abortion rights and in terms of gun control. And these are issues that the far right is very, very passionate about. And I think many on the far right, believe that we're in an existential fight for the future of this country, for the identity of this country. And the front line is places like Minnesota.
You know, I wonder about the reactions that came after that. There were a couple of things that Senator Mike Lee, U.S. Senator, had posted and later retracted. But it said, this is what happens when Marxists don't get their way. And another one, he says, this is nightmare on Waltz Street. Wall Street trying to connect this to the Democratic governor, Tim Walz. And I wonder, what is the impact of that kind of rhetoric where that becomes, I guess, almost normal? What does that do to overall the climate of political violence?
I want to start by actually saying that Lee retracted that, and we should applaud him for that, because a lot of people haven't been doing that, and that is key. That is key to reducing violence in the future, is not celebrating it, not pointing the finger at somebody else. But to get to your question, when violence starts to be normalized, when people don't call it out for what it is, they don't call this terrorism, which is what it is. If they don't take responsibility for it, or they dismiss it, or they use it for political gain, it normalizes violence. And if violence is normalized, or if it's even celebrated, then extremists, and those are the ones who tend to use violence, extremists begin to think that it's not only legitimate, but that it's something that they should do, and they'll learn that they won't be punished for it. And again, if you have the motive, you don't want progressive policies in your state, you don't want the Democrats in power, and you're being told from your political leaders that violence is potentially justified, and if you do it, actually they're going to blame somebody else for it, which means you'll get off. Then the incentive to pursue violence is much higher.
You pointed out something where the political violence has, I guess, a better chance in places where political power is being contested. And you had a recent Substack that was fascinating. It said, "Why the right turns to violence even when it's winning." And you said in there, today's Republicans are at peak power. They control all three branches of the federal government. They've appointed the majority of judges. They've reshaped election laws at the state level. They have the Supreme Court. They have the keys to the Cadillac and can cruise where they want. Why kill? So why are Republicans taking these acts when they have the keys to the Cadillac, as you say?
Because they know their power is fragile. They understand that they have lost the popular vote in 7 out of the last 8 presidential elections. They do not, for the most part, have the support of a majority of the Americans. And that is also true of many of their policies. Most Americans, and this includes citizens of red states, support stricter gun control laws. Most people in America support the right to choose. And yet most Americans don't think we should cut Medicaid and Social Security. So the policies that they're pursuing they know might be popular with a minority of quite wealthy Americans, but they are not popular with a majority of the Americans. So if you're in this tenuous position where you're in power and you essentially right now hold the keys to the Cadillac, you're very aware that those keys can be taken away quite quickly. And what they're doing now with violence is not about punishing people who are against Trump or critical of Trump or are liberal judges. They are pursuing an intimidation strategy designed to quiet people, to deter them from running in the future. They're trying to lock in their power in the future. This is a future-oriented strategy. It's about convincing people that any sort of criticism or any sort of challenge is going to lose and is actually quite dangerous for them. And they want to essentially get with violence what they can't guarantee at the ballot box.
You know, when you look at political violence and where it's coming from in the United States, it's true that there are incidents from the far left, but I wonder, what does the data show when it comes to which side of the political spectrum is engaged in this? And is this proportional? Is it the same?
We have amazing data on the incidence of political violence here in the country going back decades. And if you look at it, it's fascinating. In the 60s and 70s, the vast majority of political violence was done by the far left. And I think so a lot of people in this country still associate sort of terrorism and violence in this country with groups, for example, radical environmentalist groups or anarchist groups. This is what we saw for the most part decades ago. But Domestic terrorism and political violence plummeted after the Timothy McVeigh attacks in Oklahoma City. He was probably a member of a far-right militia in Michigan. And his attack and just the absolute devastation of that really shocked Americans into walking away and pulling their support from a lot of militias and from no longer tolerating this type of violence. And the FBI, importantly, became quite aggressive in going after these sorts of violent extremists in this country. And if you look at the graph, it just plummeted after 1995. It started to increase again around 2010, 2012. And then it started to increase rapidly, and it continues to increase today. But the perpetrators of the new violence are quite different. It's overwhelmingly far-right groups. So the left, it's still around a little bit. It has increased a little bit over the last few years, but there is exponentially more violence coming from the far right, and it's much more deadly from the type of violence that's happening on the left. So it's not, for example, targeted at infrastructure and buildings. It's targeted at people. And as you know, as we saw this past weekend, it's actually effective. They're actually succeeding in assassinating and intimidating lots of different public figures. So that what's happening today is coming overwhelmingly from the far right.
Just in the last couple of weeks, we have seen the deployment of National Guard troops President Trump said, to quell the violence and the political protests that were happening in Los Angeles. And Governor Gavin Newsom of California has described it as what we're witnessing is not law enforcement, it's authoritarianism. And I wonder how you kind of see that decision to put U.S. troops on the ground in the United States.
This is a classic move by dictators and by individuals who want to be dictators. They like to send a signal to protesters that if you go out in the street, we're going to react. It's going to be costly to you. And so you should stay at home. So it's a deterrence strategy. And so I think he went into Los Angeles in part to send a signal to Atlanta and to Austin and to Boston and to other citizens around the country who are angry and might join those protests. It's going to get ugly and it's not going to be safe. And you should just stay silent. But I also think he was pursuing a second strategy, and he's backed down from this, but it's still in his toolkit. So watch out for it. And the second strategy is something we call a provocation strategy. So one of the things that autocrats like to do is they like to provoke some sort of attack. And that could be from an enemy outside the United States, hopefully a weaker enemy outside the United States, but it could also be from somebody they perceive to be an enemy within the state. And you provoke violence from this group. Then you capture that rioting or violence or throwing bricks into storefronts on video, and you use this to convince the rest of America that protesters are terrorists, protesters are the enemy, protesters are not real Americans. And this then not only justifies using force against them, but it justifies potentially declaring martial law or instituting emergency powers. It's a way for autocrats to grab more power and have the compliance or the support of citizens, because ultimately human beings are all the same. When given a choice between feeling secure and safe and having freedom, they will choose safety and security over rights and freedoms. And so autocrats will manufacture crises, or they will manufacture violence so that they can then turn to citizens and say, you know something, we are all in danger from these hostile forces. I will take care of it, but I'm going to need extraordinary powers to do that.
There have been some recent survey data about how comfortable people are with political violence. This is according to the Chicago Project on Security and Threats. The most recent survey in May revealed that about 40% of Democrats supported the use of force to remove Mr. Trump from the presidency. About 25% of Republicans supported the use of the military to stop protests against Mr. Trump's agenda. And that these numbers more than doubled since last fall. What does that say to you?
It says that Americans are becoming more and more unhappy with the status quo, and that they are more willing to use violence to change it, that they're seeing it as an acceptable tool to get what they want. For me, one of the most troubling aspects of that new survey is if you look generationally, the group that supports it the most are Generation Z. So it's the younger generation actually that is more willing to use violence, that sees violence as more acceptable than, for example, the baby boomers. And I think my interpretation of that is that they've grown up in a more violent world. They've grown up in a world where leaders legitimize violence, where presidents sort of encourage it, where they've watched people engage in what might in the past have been considered treason and certainly punishable. The January 6th insurrectionists, they've watched them be pardoned. And so they've lived in a world where violence is not as shocking and as taboo as it was when you and I grew up. The message this sends is that this is acceptable behavior. And we're starting to see that in the attitudes of average citizens. And we're starting to see it in what some of the more extreme elements of the population are willing to do.
Barbara F. Walter, thanks so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Hari.